What I'm going to present is the paper we've put together. It's a demonstration paper rather than a research paper, but it's to raise some of the issues or illustrate some of the issues if we're going to design a competence assessment process. And my system is not behaving. Come on, thank you. So I'm just going to outline the sort of things that are discussed in the paper. I'm assuming you can go and read the detail in the paper should you wish. So there are 7 major points covered. First of all, the meaning of competence, work-based learning and portfolios and how they relate. Fairly common way of recording experience on work-based learning experiences. Professional skills frameworks and assessment and how the professional skills frameworks do assessment, or the organizations that produce them organize assessment. A very brief overview of the scheme we developed to assess the portfolio against the skills framework, but the presentation in the paper is only for one part of competency, as I'll explain more in a moment, only just for technical competence. Perhaps the key message for anyone else who's thinking of designing such a scheme is the sort of things that have to be done to validation of the assessment scheme. You can't just divide something out of thin air and hope it works, but to make sure it does. There is in the paper a demonstration of how it works, and some comments at the end on the verification of the portfolio evidence. The items in red I'm going to say a little bit more about, but all of these are covered in the paper itself. Now, first of all, competence. Well, competence is a heavily overloaded term. It means all sorts of things to all sorts of different people. And depending on context, it can refer to personal competencies, particular personal competencies, or a set of them. For example, the set found, discovered in the or identified in the multiple versions of 21st century skills, and there's no single version of that. The EU is trying to come up with one as well, but it's yet another set. It isn't, they're not unique, or they're not single valued. It can just mean technical competence. Can they someone physically do something? Sometimes that's referred to just as skills. But the thing that I and my co-author was interested in, and a team that we worked with over a number of years, is professional competence, which is a combination of personal competencies and technical skills exercised in a real environment. And there are all sorts of approaches that go part of the way towards this. We've tried to pull everything together into a single approach. And indeed, ISO 24773, which is cited in the paper, requires the repeated successful application of knowledge and skills to complete tasks in a professional manner and reproducibly over a period of time. That's a little bit more than just being able to do a task once. Professional skills frameworks. Professional skills frameworks usually describe both technical and personal competencies in a variety of formats, in a variety of ways. They link them together and so on. And although the papers consider skills frameworks for computing, they exist also for other disciplines such as teaching, nursing, engineering. There's various things covered under the European Competency Framework for different disciplines. So these things exist across a range of disciplines. We focus particularly on SPHERE, the skills framework for the information age, which has some similarity to ECF, but is not the same and actually predates it. It defines 121 technical skills in the broad area of computing and IT at up to 7 levels of responsibility. And the levels of responsibility are what capture and express the personal competencies. And one of the nice things about SPHERE is that these two aspects, the technical skills and levels of responsibility, are orthogonal. They're independent, so you can assess either the technical skills and the corresponding level of responsibility, but the assessment for the personal characteristic are the same regardless of the skill, which is quite nice. And in Sophia, to be competent, you need repeated successful demonstration of most of the skill components of the technical skill, typically within the practice in the user community for Sophia. That means 85% of the components of a skill, which is just the items listed, and also repeated demonstration of the personal competencies specified for that level of skill over an extended period. Now, all of those things are a bit tricky to achieve in the classroom. They need probably to be done in a work-based environment, which is why you probably need to be looking at a portfolio which has recorded the evidence of achievements in a workplace environment over a period of time. In the professional skills framework, in the Sophia world itself, the assessment would be by a line manager or in an interview by an external assessor, but it's actually looking at the person in the whole in an environment where you have to be, can be confident that everything is valid and that they haven't really done what they've said they've done. So for portfolios, the challenge is a little different. You have to assume that the portfolio is a near contemporaneous record of achievements. We'll come a little bit more to that in a moment. And the assessment simply counts the portfolio entries which are contained in individual, containing evidence for application of skills or demonstration of the personal competencies. And technical competence actually requires evidence of reflection as well. That's an important part of, it's not just technical achievement, it's also reflection. And there is an algorithm then that determines whether there are sufficient entries demonstrating these components across the portfolio. And there are also quality criteria that assess try to evaluate the quality of the entries. That's all described in the paper. The point is, of course, that competence requires both technical competence, technical achievement and reflection, and sufficient demonstration of personal competencies. We have tool support for both. This particular paper demonstrates the assessment of technical competence from the portfolio. There are other papers that look at the assessment of personal competencies, even if I can't spell described. The B on my keyboard is sticking, sorry about that. And they're just demonstrated elsewhere. One of the important things is if you put together a really important thing, and it's something which sometimes is overlooked, that if you do put together an assessment scheme, you have to make sure it can only deliver appropriate, consistent results. And you have to therefore identify a set of test cases and run them, all of them. Some of them may fail. For example, in one of the other papers discussing this work, we found that one of the test cases could fail in the extreme circumstance that the student supervisor in the workplace refused to validate or comment on any of the entries. Well, why should the student be penalized because the supervisor is uncooperative? And you have to say, are there circumstances in which that is okay? And the paper actually illustrates the examination of one test case. There are, I think, 5 which we identified at a high level. And if you're developing any assessment scheme, the point is that this sort of approach is needed. You devise the scheme, decide what all the thresholds and the weightings are and how everything hangs together. And then you've got to make sure it gives the right sort of results that you can rely on. And that the matches, for example, is consistent with industry practice. one of the things we often forget is that as academics, we put something together and we say, we're academics, we know how we're supposed to do this, but it's not how industry understands these things, and it's not how industry has often been doing these things for quite a long time. And we have to make sure that the test cases we come up with ensure that any assessment is consistent with an industry understanding. And one of the big questions with the portfolio, and you don't see a student on a work placement actually doing their job. You have to rely on what they've recorded. And frankly, how do you know in any particular portfolio submission is true? And this is particularly a growing issue in the days of GPT. We haven't actually, and it would be an interesting and amusing exercise to ask ChatGPT to construct a portfolio demonstrating evidence of these things and see how we would assess it. But one of the ways, the primary way we address this in the paper is we require verification of the entries by the student supervisor, which would also ideally not just verify the content, but also contextualize it, suggest comment on the difficulty, commenting on how well the student did and performed and that sort of thing. Okay, well, that's one step of verification, but how do you know the supervisor's comments are genuine? And here you get down to practical issues. In the university where I used to run placements, we had direct contact with the company. We visited the students on placement, so we knew what they were getting up to. So we had some sort of cross-referencing and triangulation. An approach that is taken by one of the professional bodies is any verifier, the supervisor in this case, needs to be a member of a professional body with a code of which has a code of conduct, so you can allegedly trust them to be telling the truth, because otherwise, how could you know? And also, you need to be able to check that they are a member of the professional body. But there's still an issue of forgery and so on, which it requires further work. There's also further work to do on the quality of the portfolio evidence. What do we mean by evidence in a portfolio? And there's the various comments made in the paper that you don't just want a narrative, you want something that shows how much they did, how hard it was, and so on. Okay, that's all I was going to comment on, because the paper is there. I've just sort of indicated why it's important. And in fact, if we just go back to the first paper, it's these are the points that it tries to make. And I think that's really quite the point of the paper. It's not producing any interesting statistical results. It's just a practice paper raising issues that have to be addressed and showing how it can be done.
I'm sorry, but I have to comment this paper, at least on the part that has to do with the definition of the competences. Because I have to say, I'm sorry that I do not agree at all with the definition which people is defined competent because it's able to reproduce a certain behavior successfully. I mean, any kind of definition of competence that has to do with repetition cannot be acceptable, because otherwise we should consider competent also ChatGPT. So in general,
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, in this way, we should consider competent also ChatGPT or any kind of artificial intelligence. I mean, in general, you can consider, as I was saying before, I mean, you can consider competent, an individual can be considered competent if they can produce some new cultural object, if they can find a solution in a known domain, not if they can repeat, I mean, a procedure successfully. So that's at least in my opinion. Sorry for that, but
I think that's an interesting point, and I think it's It's very much an academic view with respect, because it assumes that what matters is, can you take what you've learned and apply it and produce a new solution in a new situation? It's not what employers are interested in. What employers are in is knowing that if you ask someone to do something, they have done it several times, otherwise they wouldn't be deemed competent. And it's really the consistency of the performance that is, as much as anything. Yes, one of the personal characteristics is being innovative. And so you have to show innovation, but it's not all that's required. I think that it is one of the difficulties of what is meant by competence. I have heard what you were describing, Carlo, as academic competence, and I'm totally happy with that if it's qualified. But it is not the sort of competence that professional competence that people are looking for, that employers tend to be looking
No,
for.
it's okay. But this is a skill. We can agree that professional competence, professional are looking for skill. Companies are looking for skill, but then are skill and not competences. It's just a question of definition, how you define it. Okay.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely, and that's one of the reasons which I tried to set out at the beginning of the paper, the different kinds of competencies. There wasn't room to include everything, but it gives some people some pointers to start a discussion.